A child stands barefoot in the dirt of a rural Mexican village. He watches his father beat his mother. There is no food on the table, no electricity, no water, just hunger, violence, and the bitter sting of a future that seems already written. But in the shadows of this forgotten corner of the world, another path waits, one that promises money, respect, and power, one that millions of young men across Mexico will take, believing it leads to salvation. But this path doesn't end in glory. It ends in betrayal, blood, and a prison cell. This is the story of how cartel bosses are created and why that creation is always temporary. To understand how a cartel boss is born, you must first understand the soil from which he grows. Mexico's rural regions, particularly in states like Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Michoacán, are places where poverty isn't just a statistic, it's a sentence. Between 2006 and 2010, the proportion of Mexico's population living in extreme or moderate poverty rose from 35% to 46%, affecting over 52 million people. In these regions, families survive on less than half the median income, living in homes without running water or electricity. Children grow up watching their parents break their backs in fields that yield barely enough to eat. They see their mothers weep over empty pots. They feel the ache of hunger gnawing at their ribs night after night. In Sinaloa, a state that would become the birthplace of some of the world's most notorious drug lords, the mountains are unforgiving. The communities are remote, sometimes hours away from the nearest school. Traveling teachers come and go, staying for a few months before moving on, leaving children with fragmented educations. In these isolated villages, smuggling has been a way of life for generations. During Prohibition, families smuggled alcohol across the US border. Later, it was marijuana and opium. The border between legality and survival has always been thin in these places, and when survival is at stake, morality becomes a luxury no one can afford. This is not an excuse, it is context. It is the breeding ground where desperation meets opportunity, and where young boys learn that the law protects those who have everything and punishes those who have nothing. Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera, better known as El Chapo, was born on April 4, 1957, in the rural community of La Tuna, Badiraguato, Sinaloa. His family was poor, struggling farmers who worked land that barely sustained them, but poverty was only part of the nightmare. El Chapo's father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos, was a violent man, a drunk who beat his children regularly. Joaquín endured this abuse for years, sometimes fleeing to his grandmother's house to escape his father's fists. He stood between his father and his younger siblings, taking beatings meant for them. His mother was his only source of emotional support in a house ruled by fear. By his early teens, El Chapo had dropped out of school. He only made it to 3rd grade. The nearest school was over 100 kilometers away, and the education he received was sporadic at best. He sold oranges on the street, trying to bring in whatever money he could, but it was never enough. His father eventually kicked him out of the house, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that offered no safety net. But with little schooling, no job prospects, and no future visible on the horizon, Joaquín Guzmán did what his father had done before him. He entered the drug trade. He started small, growing marijuana in the mountains for local dealers. The work was hard, the pay was minimal, but it was more than he had ever made selling oranges. And more importantly, it was a doorway into a world where power wasn't inherited, it was taken. El Chapo's story is not unique. Across Mexico, thousands of young men grow up in similar conditions. They come from homes destroyed by addiction, violence, and poverty. They watch their fathers disappear into drugs or prison. They see their mothers work themselves to exhaustion for wages that can't feed a family. And they learn very early that the legal system isn't designed to help them, it's designed to contain them. Or in the absence of hope, the cartels offer something that feels like salvation: money, protection, and a sense of belonging. Cartels don't just recruit, they seduce. They target children from at-risk neighborhoods, often as young as 13 or 14 years old. These are kids who have dropped out of school, who come from violent homes, who are already experimenting with drugs. The cartels offer them a weekly wage of $250, with bonuses of $500 to $750 for each event, a euphemism for murder. For a child who has never had more than a few pesos in his pocket, this is life-changing money. But the money is only part of the appeal. The cartels also offer what these children desperately crave: a family. They provide structure, discipline, and a sense of purpose. Many recruits are brought in by relatives or friends who are already involved. When they join because they want to belong to something, because they want to feel powerful in a world that has made them feel invisible, and because, in the brutal calculus of survival, working for a cartel seems safer than staying where they are. According to the Network for Children's Rights in Mexico, organized crime groups have recruited approximately 350,000 young people, with another 400,000 considered vulnerable to recruitment. These children start as lookouts or drug runners, jobs the cartels describe as easy, without risks. But the reality is far more dangerous. Even the lowest level work involves constant exposure to violence, arrest, and death. And once a child enters the cartel world, leaving becomes almost impossible. The cartels don't accept resignations. Betrayal is met with torture and execution. And for someone like Joaquín Guzmán, entry into the drug trade wasn't a dramatic recruitment. It was a gradual slide facilitated by his father's involvement and the complete absence of alternatives. By the late 1970s, he was working with Héctor Luis Palma Salazar, one of the nation's rising drug lords. He demonstrated a natural aptitude for logistics, organization, and ruthlessness. He understood how to move product, how to negotiate, and how to eliminate obstacles. These skills would carry him from the marijuana fields of Sinaloa to the leadership of the most powerful drug cartel in the world. El Chapo's rise through the ranks of the Sinaloa cartel was methodical. He joined the Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s under the leadership of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, learning the intricacies of large-scale drug trafficking. When the Guadalajara cartel fractured in the late 1980s, Guzmán seized the opportunity to build his own operation. He allied himself with Ismael El Mayo Zambada Garcia, a former farmer and freelance trafficker who had worked his way into Mexico's elite trafficking circles. Together, they transformed the Sinaloa cartel into a global empire. By the mid-1990s, the organization was believed to rival the Medellin cartel at its peak. Guzmán's genius lay in his understanding of logistics and corruption. He built sophisticated tunnels under the US-Mexico border to smuggle drugs. He bribed politicians, judges, and police officers at every level of government. He diversified his operations, trafficking not just marijuana and cocaine, but also heroin and methamphetamine. And he used violence strategically, eliminating rivals and enforcing loyalty through fear. But El Chapo's rise was not just about business acumen, it was also about brutality. The Sinaloa cartel waged wars against rival organizations, leaving bodies hanging from bridges and severed heads in public squares. The message was always the same: defiance would be met with death. This was how power was consolidated in the cartel world, not through elections or diplomacy, but through blood. Other cartel leaders followed similar trajectories. Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, leader of the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación, CJNG, spent time in U.S. prison, where he recruited for his organization. Pablo Acosta, one of the earliest Mexican narco kingpins, grew up in rural poverty in Chihuahua, where his family had been involved in petty smuggling for generations. And these men rose to power not because they were born into privilege, but because they were willing to do what others wouldn't. They were willing to kill, to betray, to sacrifice everything, including their humanity, for a shot at wealth and respect. At the height of his power, El Chapo was one of the richest men in the world. Forbes listed him among the world's most powerful people. He controlled drug routes across North America, moving billions of dollars worth of cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamine into the United States every year. He owned ranches, mansions, and private zoos. He had an army of sicarios, hitmen, who would kill on command. Politicians and law enforcement officials were on his payroll. He moved through Mexico with impunity, protected by a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. And for Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the co-founder of the Sinaloa Cartel, the peak of power meant something different. Unlike El Chapo, Zambada avoided the spotlight. He never posed for photographs. He never gave interviews. He operated in the shadows, managing the cartel's operations with quiet efficiency. For decades, he evaded capture, becoming one of the most elusive figures in the drug trade. Together, El Chapo and El Mayo turned the Sinaloa cartel into a criminal empire that operated like a multinational corporation with supply chains, distribution networks, and enforcement arms. But this power came at a cost. The violence required to maintain control left thousands dead. Rival cartels fought back, leading to turf wars that turned entire Mexican cities into battlefields. The government, under pressure from the United States, launched military operations against the cartels, deploying the Mexican army and federal police in a kingpin strategy designed to capture or kill cartel leaders. The more powerful the cartels became, the more enemies they created. And in the cartel world, enemies never forget. Power in the cartel world is never permanent. It is built on shifting alliances, mutual fear, and the constant threat of betrayal. And sooner or later, the cracks begin to show. For El Chapo, the beginning of the end came with his first arrest in 1993. He was captured in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But prison was not the end of his career. It was barely an interruption. In 2001, he escaped from a maximum security facility, reportedly hidden in a laundry cart, and he returned to the Sinaloa cartel and resumed control, continuing to expand the organization's operations. But his second reign was marked by increasing paranoia and violence. Rival cartels were closing in. The Mexican government, under intense pressure from the United States, intensified its efforts to capture him. And within the Sinaloa cartel, tensions were rising. In 2014, El Chapo was captured again, this time in the coastal city of Mazatlan. He was placed in Mexico's most secure prison, but once again he escaped, this time through a mile-long tunnel that had been dug directly into his cell. The escape was a humiliation for the Mexican government and a demonstration of the cartel's power. But it also marked the beginning of El Chapo's final chapter. The United States ramped up its efforts to bring him to justice, and in 2016, he was captured for the third and final time. In 2017, he was extradited to the United States, where he faced charges including drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder. In 2019, he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. For Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the cracks came from an unexpected direction: betrayal by an ally. In July 2024, Joaquín Guzmán López, one of El Chapo's sons, lured Zambada onto a private plane under the pretense of a real estate deal. Instead, Guzmán López delivered him to U.S. authorities in Texas. It was an extraordinary act of treachery, one that ignited a violent war within the Sinaloa cartel between Zambada's loyalists known as Los Mayos and the faction led by El Chapo's sons, known as Los Chapitos. The violence left over 1,200 people dead in Sinaloa alone. A betrayal is the currency of the cartel world. Allies become enemies. Brothers turn on each other. Trust is a weakness that gets exploited. In 2017, a high-ranking member of the CJNG, named Carlos Enrique Sanchez, known as El Cholo, betrayed his boss, Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera, by orchestrating robberies and withholding the proceeds. When his betrayal was exposed, he fled the cartel and formed his own gang. His punishment was brutal. He was eventually captured and executed, his body mutilated as a warning to others. These betrayals are not anomalies, they are inevitable. In a world built on violence and greed, loyalty is always conditional. And when the stakes are this high, everyone is expendable. El Chapo's downfall was not swift. It took 3 arrests, 2 escapes, and decades of pursuit by law enforcement agencies in Mexico and the United States. But in the end, he was brought down not by a rival cartel, but by the very governments he had spent years corrupting and evading. His final capture in 2016 came after a meeting with actor Sean Penn, who was working on a magazine article. Mexican authorities, tipped off by the meeting, tracked El Chapo to a safe house in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. After a shootout with Mexican Marines, he was apprehended. His extradition to the United States was a turning point. In American custody, he had no leverage, no corruption to exploit, no tunnels to escape through. In 2019, El Chapo was convicted on 10 counts, including drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 30 years. He is currently held in ADX Florence, a supermax prison in Colorado known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. He spends 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. He will never see freedom again. Ismael El Mayo. Zambada's downfall came in a different form, but the result was the same. After being betrayed and delivered to U.S. authorities in 2024, he was charged with engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise and racketeering conspiracy. In January 2025, he pleaded guilty, admitting to running a vast criminal empire for over 5 decades. In court, he acknowledged the harm caused by his actions, saying, "I recognize the great harm that illegal drugs have done to the people of the United States and Mexico and elsewhere." He faces life in prison and is due to be sentenced on January 13, 2025, U.S. Thai Attorney General Pam Bondi called the plea a landmark victory, stating, "El Mayo will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will die in a U.S. federal prison where he belongs." Other cartel leaders have met even more violent ends. Arturo Beltrán Leiva, founder of the Beltrán Leiva cartel, was killed in a shootout with Mexican Marines in 2009. Heriberto Lacano, leader of Los Zetas, was killed by Mexican forces in 2012. Jorge Humberto Figueroa, a leader of the Sinaloa cartel's Chapitos faction, was killed in a 2025 raid with a $1 million bounty on his head. The pattern is always the same, no matter how powerful a cartel leader becomes, but the end is always violent, always inevitable. They are either killed by rivals, captured by authorities, or betrayed by their own people. There is no retirement plan in the cartel world. There is no peaceful ending. The rise and fall of cartel bosses leaves devastation in its wake. Between 2006 and 2026, the Mexican drug war has claimed over 350,000 lives. Entire communities have been displaced, families have been torn apart, children have been orphaned. The violence is indiscriminate, affecting not just those involved in the drug trade, but innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. In Sinaloa, the war between Los Mayos and Los Chapitos has left at least 1,200 people dead since September 2024. Bodies are found in the streets, families are terrorized, businesses are extorted, the government struggles to maintain control. And all of this stems from a betrayal at the top, a reminder that the decisions made by cartel leaders have consequences that ripple outward, destroying lives far beyond their immediate circles, while the children recruited into the cartels suffer their own form of destruction. Many are killed in their first year, others are arrested and imprisoned, their futures erased before they've even begun. And those who survive carry the trauma of what they've seen and done. One former child, Sicario, a boy named Juan, was convicted of murder at 16. He joined the cartel after his father became addicted to meth and abandoned the family. He killed for money, for survival, for a sense of belonging. And now he sits in prison, his childhood stolen, his life defined by violence. This is the true cost of the cartel world. It is not just the billions of dollars in drug profits or the power wielded by kingpins. It is the lives destroyed, the futures stolen, the communities shattered. It is the children who grow up believing that violence is the only path to respect. And it is the cycle that perpetuates itself, generation after generation, because poverty and desperation continue to create the conditions in which cartels thrive. The story of how cartel bosses are created is not a story of triumph. It is a story of desperation, violence, and self-destruction. These men rise from poverty, driven by a desire to escape the circumstances of their birth. They climb to power through ruthlessness and brutality. They amass wealth beyond imagination, and then they fall, betrayed, captured, or killed. El Chapo, once one of the most powerful men in the world, now sits in a cell the size of a parking space. He has no contact with the outside world. He will never see his family again, while he will never walk freely in the mountains of Sinaloa. His empire has crumbled. His legacy is one of bloodshed and suffering. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who evaded capture for over 50 years, will die in a U.S. federal prison. The man who once controlled drug routes across an entire continent will spend his final days locked away from the world he once dominated. This is the reality of cartel power. It is temporary, it is fragile, and it always ends the same way. The creation of a cartel boss begins with poverty, neglect, and a broken system that offers no alternatives. It continues with recruitment by organizations that prey on the vulnerable, offering money and belonging in exchange for violence. It culminates in a rise to power built on corruption, fear, and bloodshed. And it ends in prison, death, or betrayal. But the most important lesson is this: the power that cartel bosses wield is an illusion. It promises freedom but delivers captivity. It promises respect but delivers fear. It promises wealth but costs everything: family, humanity, and ultimately life itself. The cycle will continue as long as poverty, corruption, and lack of opportunity persist in Mexico and across Latin America. Young men will continue to see the cartels as a path to something better, and they will continue to learn too late that the path leads only to destruction. The story of how cartel bosses are created is not a cautionary tale for them. It is a cautionary tale for the societies that create the conditions in which they arise. Because until those conditions change, the cycle will repeat, and the bodies will continue to pile up.